Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Qul huwallahu ahad, Allahus samad, lam yalid, walam yulad, walam yakul lahu kufuwan ahad. Sadaqallahu azim. On behalf of Corporate Pakistan Group, I'm grateful to all of you for your presence here, virtual presence at our 25th webinar series. And this is all about public-private partnerships, value for people and value for future. And this is our first collaboration with Globesight, a global consulting firm. And our today's topic is very important. I'm right now doing this program from Lahore, and this is my first webinar from Lahore after starting the lockdown in April. And our today's panel is very outstanding. And we have 3 panelists and 1 chair and moderator. So our today's chair and moderator is Syed Veqar. He's a founding member of Corporate Pakistan Group. He's Chief Executive Officer and Director of Jaffer Business Systems. And he is the member policy board of SECP, Security and Exchange Commission of Pakistan. Our panelists are Fenton Whelon. He is the founder and Chief Executive at Acasus. Our second panelist is Taufiq Rahim, Executive Director of Globesight. And our third the panelist is our very active member of Corporate Pakistan Group, Fatima Asad-Said. She is the Managing Director, Corporate Governance and People Excellence at ABACUS Consulting. She is also the board member of Faisal Bank Limited, and she is also the member board of trustee of Lahore University of Management Sciences. So today is our 25th webinar in last 4 months. We are hosting different webinars, conversations and dialogues on 3 different tracks. Our first track is on the global affairs, the geopolitical affairs, for example, China-India standoff, and the overall geopolitical situation. We hosted so far 4 dialogues. Our another series is all about the way forward for Pakistan, and so far we hosted 9 editions of this specific series with the cabinet ministers, with the political parties leadership, and also the civil society leadership. And our third series is on discussion on different emerging issues, including the leadership and different other subjects, including economy and digitalization, the post-COVID era. And when the COVID started, actually, we discussed about the business situation, the economic situation. But today's topic is very important, keeping in view the current scenario globally and specifically in Pakistan, and also especially after the post-COVID world, public-private partnerships, value for people and value for future. And our today's chair and moderator is my elder brother. I think he's the best moderator in Pakistan, and many advise him after starting lockdown that your future is secure. If this lockdown will be continued, you will act as the moderator of different webinars, and he is the most busiest moderator or chair of any webinar in Pakistan. He worked with different organizations, but all these webinars and all these conversations and dialogues are really productive, and I think this is beneficial for all concerned. So without any further delay, I'm handing over the further proceedings to Veqar, our today's chair and moderator. Over to you, Veqar.
Thank you very much, Jaffer. As they say, no pressure, right? With all the introduction that you have done. Thank you very much. Thank you so much. Thank you, panelists. Thank you, audience. Like always, before we start, I do want to share a public service message. We are talking about public-private partnership. In any case today, Pakistan, alhamdulillah, by the grace of God, has done well with COVID. It does not mean COVID has gone away. It is here with its full glory, with its full power, spreading like anything. We get 250,000 cases on an average every day. Please practice social distancing. Please exercise caution. Please do not relax. Please continue the good work each one of you and each one of us have done, so that our future and the future of our elders, our children, and our generation is secure from this pandemic that we have all been dealing with in the last 6 months. Now, over to the topic. I would want to congratulate us for selecting this topic, because it's not a topic which is on a trodden path, if you like, which is on a beaten track. Where you get into webinars and you have topics which are covered in multiple different similar kind of sessions. So this is a topic which is generally not talked about, but a topic which is possibly going to be the difference between how you shape the future of countries and how you shape the future of work versus how things are going to carry on in the ways that they have been done in the last many, many decades. Public-private partnership as a concept is very powerful. Why do I say that? Think about it as a concept. Public-private partnership brings the intellect of private sector and brings the intellect of public sector combined together to deliver value to the people and to the countries that it bring the project to. And that by definition is great. The moment you are able to bring intellect of two diversified entities, typically magic should happen. It brings capital of the two, the private sector and the public sector, in such a way that combined together they deliver value so that assets and public service can be delivered faster, smarter, better. They also bring about different kind of abilities to execute a project where public sector typically is a lot more deliberate, a lot more slow if you like, but a lot more thorough in the work that is done, while the private sector brings execution, brings a lot of speed, and the two combined together can deliver projects of high value for the public sector. So as a concept, all these are brilliant. And as a concept, they must deliver value to the people of the country that it works, that they serve in. However, the naysayers, as is always the case, are always skeptical about the outcome that this PPP or public-private partnership has produced around the globe. There have been many failures. They say one of the reasons is long duration of contract, and private sector in many cases do not have the patience to carry on with those long projects, whereas public sector wants things to happen, and then the conflict happens, and the contracting is not done in such a way that it can handle such long engagement. The other point that is a lot more strongly advocated by the naysayers, that while private sector is always driven by profits and by making money, public sector is not typically for profits. They are typically for delivering services. And by definition, that creates a conflict. And over a long period of time, it gets into enough conflict, then the resultantly projects either fail or do not deliver the value. So while the concept makes a lot of sense, has it delivered the value that it is supposed to deliver to the people and the country? Has it delivered the way it should deliver? What are the pros and cons? But most importantly, if the concept is valid that I explained, what are the things one needs to be very careful about? And what are the lessons that we can learn for the future, especially for Pakistan, so that we do the right things, we avoid the risk, or we mitigate the risk in such a manner that the concept delivers the value that it is supposed to do. I think we have an amazing panelist, and I was looking at the profile of each one of them. We have Fenton, Whelon, who is the founder and CEO of Acasus Consulting, a company which is doing work not just in Pakistan, but Africa, Middle East, South America. He himself has the experience of leading transformation projects across the countries, especially in the social sectors of health and education. So he brings experience of the private sector and working with public sector and blending it together to share his ideas with us. Taufiq, Rahim, who is ex-McKinsey, by the way, Fenton is ex-McKinsey, and a fun fact, if you like, is that he's a undergrad, or he's a graduate from Oxford University in Arabic. Right. Taufiq is also ex-McKinsey. He has his undergrad from Princeton. He's a graduate of Kennedy School of Government, Harvard. Has done work in the corporate sector, has done a lot of work in the public and social sector, is leading Globesight. So he brings in again the brilliance and the intellect that I spoke about, and the experience of blending the private and the public sector. And then, of course, we have our very own Fatima Asad, who is the managing director for ABACUS Consulting on the corporate governance. done a lot of work on the people part, possibly one of the best brains available in the country when it comes to working with people and driving people towards successes. And as we all know, it's always the people behind the gun. So it's always the people behind the concept who brings the difference. So I'm sure Fatima will bring the HR element into this public-private debate as well as we go along. So I want to start with Fenton, and I want to let Fenton do the intro on how he sees this topic, not just in the context of the globe, but also in the context of developing economies like Pakistan, and how he sees us going forward with this concept, if at all he advocates this concept. Fenton, over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the kind introduction and also for inviting me to talk today. As you said, I lead Acasus, a consultancy that helps governments with health and education reforms, including in some cases designing and implementing public-private partnerships. And at the moment we have teams in 7 countries around the world. And in Pakistan we have teams on the ground in Sindh, Baluchistan, Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, Punjab, and Islamabad. And I've personally been working in Pakistan since 2009. And one of the sad things about 2020 is that I haven't been able to travel to Pakistan. And I'm looking forward to the day when not only life resumes for everyone in some sense of normality, but in particular for me, the day when I can next travel again. I think, as Veqar said, there are many reasons to believe that a public-private partnership, in theory, could be the best way for a government to deliver health and education services. And I'm going to focus on those two because that's where most of my work is. You have funding from the government, which is particularly important to ensure that services reach the poorest. You have a number of other things that government brings to the table, including knowledge, the ability to invest in public goods, and so on. At the same time, you have all of the advantages of the private sector, freedom from many of the rules that can constrain government, greater autonomy, greater flexibility, sometimes a greater ability to partner with others, and perhaps most importantly, greater accountability. And from a citizen's perspective, therefore, public-private partnerships offer not just therefore better services, but also often choice and diversity, which are good in and of themselves, and in many cases also lower costs, which at least in theory would translate into lower taxes. All of that said, though, when you look at the data and the evidence, that promise often hasn't been delivered. In the developed world, for instance, on average, when you correct for all factors, private schools actually deliver slightly less learning than government schools. And there are, while there are many fantastic examples of public-private partnerships working really well, on average, the improvements have been much smaller than what people hoped for. And in some cases, they've made things worse. And I think what's particularly interesting in that perspective is that Pakistan has actually been a lot more successful than many other countries in public-private partnerships. And as I talk to people around the world, this is an area in which Pakistan is often seen as a pioneer and a success story. And to take just one example, the Punjab Education Foundation, this is something that is globally recognized as a success story that other countries are using as a model. It is, I believe at the moment, the largest public-private partnership in education anywhere in the world, at least in terms of the number of students it serves. It has, across many separate different evaluations, been proved to be delivering quality. And it's doing all of that at around about half the cost per student of the government system. So this is a great example of a public-private partnership working in exactly the way that the theorists hoped it would. That's not to say it's perfect, but it's good. And you see in Pakistan many other examples of the same thing, be it other education partnerships, partnerships in other sectors. There's a number of really good examples in the health sector as well. And I think Pakistan's experience of those successes, but also of public-private partnerships that haven't worked as well, has a lot of lessons for the world. And I just wanted to pick up on 5 of those drawing from Pakistan, but also from the global evidence. And the first lesson is that there is clearly huge potential for these partnerships to be successful. There are enough examples to show that it can work. But the second lesson perhaps is that doesn't mean it will work. And the private sector isn't a magic wand that you can wave at a government service and it will get better. And the third detail thing, and I think absolutely the most important thing, is there are a lot of details to get right, and those details matter a lot. And small things that you get wrong in either the design or the implementation can make the difference between success and failure. And Veqar already talked about the length of contracts, and how if you get the length too long, it can go wrong. If you get it too short, it can go wrong because the private sector doesn't feel it has enough on the table to make this interesting. And there are all kinds of examples of where getting the monitoring system slightly wrong can create perverse incentives, where you make small mistakes in the rules or the payment structures and things like this. So there's a lot of detail to get right, and the difference between success and failure is often in those small details. The fourth lesson, I think, is that trust and dialogue are very important. And this was alluded to in the introduction, but at the beginning, the private sector, certainly in every PPP I've worked on, the private sector starts off being very skeptical about the government. You know, are they really committed? Are they capable? Will they actually pay? Will they even do this? Will a new politician come along and just cancel everything? And so you tend to start from a point where the private sector is very skeptical. And at the same time, and this isn't true of every bureaucrat, but the public sector often think the private sector are just interested in the money. They're going to exploit every loophole. They don't care about the children. They don't care about people's health. All they're in this for is the money. And then the reality, of course, is always, while those sectors operate under different conditions and different constraints, the vast majority of people in the private sector also want to see children get a good education and people get good healthcare. And similarly, the government often has many dedicated, hardworking officials who also want to make it work. And so that process of dialogue and trust building that happens at the beginning, I think is really important. And then perhaps the fifth lesson is that implementation is more important than design. I've seen lots of PPPs where the government and the private sector spend months working on trying to get the terms of reference exactly right, and the contract exactly right, and the design exactly right. And then they release the contracts and sign them. And then all of the real problems start because the contracts aren't being managed properly. They're not adjusting as things change. They're not learning as the process unfolds. And that whole process of implementation, I think, is a lot more important than the initial design, even though, of course, that initial design is also important. So those are a few lessons. And then I just wanted to end on one final reflection about COVID and this year. And when I think about the response of the world to COVID, it illustrates that if you're going to do something really difficult, really fast, a public-private partnership is the only way to do it. And if you think about something like the challenge of a COVID vaccine, if you were to depend on government laboratories to develop that vaccine, we'd be waiting for a long time. So you need the flexibility, the dynamism, the incentives, the accountability of the private sector. But at the same time, if it weren't for government funding, government's willingness to take on risk, government's willingness to help deliver the vaccine when it's available, you also wouldn't see a vaccine for a very long time. And then the same is true of diagnostics of some of the responses that were happening in March and April and so on. And so it's a great example of a big, difficult problem where the only way to solve it is to get the public-private partnership right. And I think there might be some longer-term lessons in that for health and education more broadly. So let me hand back to the floor, and I'm looking forward to hearing the other panelists as well.
Thank you, Fenton. Thank you. Great insight, great intro. I picked up a few things, and it is interesting how experience varies from countries to countries. And you did talk about the fact that data suggests that public school in public school, the learning is a lot better than what it is in the private school. Interestingly enough, the perception and possibly the real data also suggests that in Pakistan, it's actually possibly the other way around. I loved your COVID example because I think it is actually a great example of how the two can work together to deal with a crisis which is novel, which is unorthodox, and which doesn't need a typical, beaten approach to get to the solution. And it's great how public and private sector is coming together to produce something in months or possibly maximum a year, which typically takes many, many years. Pakistan Punjab Education Foundation is a great example, and great to hear that Pakistan is considered as a success story on how best to execute public-private partnership and this whole concept and take it forward. So a lot of great insight with all your 5 points that you explained. And also, I just want to emphasize on the point that where you said execution is more important than design. Now, it doesn't mean design is not important, but at the end of the day, it is about execution. And if you don't know how to execute a perfectly well-made design, then at the end, the project will be a failure, whereas half-cooked design executed well may still have some chances for success. So thank you for those insights. Taufiq, I now come to you, and if you can build on to some of the concepts Fenton spoke about in public-private partnership, and you can be against the concept as well, and I'm fine with that. That will start some interesting debate for us to take it forward. But it would be good to get your perspective from your work around the world as to how you see this developing, especially in developing economies, countries like Pakistan, and what are the things that we need to be aware of to make it a greater success than what Fenton actually already spoke about, which, as I said, is already great to hear. So Taufiq, over to you.
Great. Thank you, Syed Veqar, and thank you for having me here today. It's really a pleasure to partner with CPG on this important conversation. And I think for us, a conversation that's important for Pakistan, but then also for the world, because I think Pakistan is an integral part of the geopolitical and economic fabric of the world's future. And so I think the more audiences we can reach with this conversation, the better. I also want to acknowledge our senior advisor in Pakistan, Maha Qasim, also a Princeton graduate at a different time, for helping put us as organizations together. And just a last note around McKinsey, it's they have a joke that you can take the consultant out of McKinsey, but you can't take the McKinsey out of the consultant. But I've been going through PowerPoint withdrawal from different times, and so we can talk more about that at some point and the pitfalls of overusing McKinsey. But that's maybe a off-the-record conversation that we can talk about on
As long as we don't have PowerPoint today, that means you've done that.
Very good, very good. Well, Globesight, for us, we are really an organization of the global East and South. That's how we position ourselves and how we build ourselves. But we have strong linkages throughout the world and with some of the world's leading organizations. Our offices are in Dubai, Turkey, also New York, and we're establishing in Pakistan in addition to our staff who are already there. We try to inject into the global conversation around partnerships is the idea that it should not just be the same actors that we see all the time and the same perspectives. It's very important to what we do. And actually what underpins a lot of our work is the philosophy of what is Sustainable Development Goal 17, SDG 17. Now there's 17 SDGs, and if you go through 1 through 16, you're going to look at goals around health and education and water, and 17 is actually the goal for partnerships. So in the SDGs, unlike the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals, the international community came together and said, we need an entire goal just on partnerships. And it's actually not just partnerships. There's a number of dimensions that are involved there, including knowledge sharing, including a technology bank, for example, that's been set up in Turkey, and a number of other areas. That shows the complexity and dexterity required to build the right partnerships to advance really what is the topic of this webinar, the people's future of this world, right? So the future of the people of this world, that's what the SDGs are about towards 2030. So imbued in all the work that we do, and actually in much of what my experience has been in a number of organizations, and I think Fenton and we've worked together in different ways, and I think ideally we were hoping to do a lot of great things in Pakistan together. This webinar being a start, hopefully with the COVID pandemic, we really want to bring our expertise. We really believe in the future of Pakistan, and hopefully we will all be able to work together. Also with you, Fatima, really excited to be on this panel with you. But then, how you look at SDG 17 and what it's trying to do is really think about, if you want to achieve any of these big impacts, right, around health or education or infrastructure, no one can do it alone. Not a country, not a state, not a government, not a corporate. If we really want to move the needle, we really have to think about partnerships. Now, the partnerships we talked about, COVID, the global health partnerships around the world that have come up in the last 15, 20 years have truly been impressive. So we have organizations like Gavi and the Global Fund. These are the two largest health financing instruments in the world, actually larger in many ways than the World Health Organization, which is another conversation around the health sector. But they are, in and of themselves, in their founding, public-private partnerships, multi-billion-dollar public-private partnerships. So the Global Fund for HIV, tuberculosis, and malaria, which was had its recent replenishment in 2019, hosted by President of France, Emmanuel Macron, basically put together $14 billion for the next 3 years. So that is the extent of that global partnership, and that allows them to deliver. Gavi just had the replenishment recently, hosted by Boris Johnson in the COVID era, right? And Gavi and the Global Fund are in collaboration with CEPI, which is the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, and a couple of other organizations, part of something called the ACT Accelerator, which ultimately is the framework umbrella, which is one giant public-private partnership to enable diagnostics, treatment, and vaccines, research and development, but then eventually distribution, manufacturing out of this COVID crisis. So imbued in actually the moment we're in the health institutions, is the idea of public-private partnerships, which, as Fenton mentioned and you echoed, Syed Veqar, is so important in actually having a success in terms of the response that we're talking about. But one topic I'm going to come back and allude to, which is around the recovery and the growth, which is now where a lot of attention is focused, even though COVID has not gone away, will require an even deeper, grand global bargain around partnerships. Now, in a place like Pakistan, which is a country of enormous resources, talent, population, diversity, and unfortunately need, the potential of PPP and its role is immense. So public-private partnerships are integral to any development strategy for Pakistan. We cannot talk about any sector without talking about PPP. However, we have to also acknowledge certain aspects around inequality, corruption, and abdication of public services, not as constant realities, but as potential risks, potential challenges that can undermine the success of PPE. So PPE can go in two directions, can either be a success or can be a failure. And if you don't take into account the challenges, obviously you can veer off into the latter. But the challenge if you go into a failure is double-fold, because then the public loses trust in public-private partnerships. And if you have that increasing suspicion, that disables you down the road. So in Pakistan, we've had tremendous success in some of the examples that Fenton mentioned. I'm sure Fatima will also talk about. And other areas like energy, we can talk about the Thar energy project, which is a very interesting one, took some time, but then with the right incentives and guarantees was there. But we also have challenging ones that I know quite a bit about. Karachi Electric, I think many of you are familiar with some aspects of that. So you can have both kind of unfold, in Pakistan. The roads, I think some of the toll roads are tremendous successes, right, that have enabled infrastructure where otherwise there wouldn't be. As you move forward, in Pakistan, I think there are examples to draw from, both globally and locally. But again, like I mentioned, you have to balance these two aspects. So I talked about the role of the government and how it needs, and then there's the role of the private sector. And let me just talk a little bit about that. So one of the things that the sovereign government does in a public-private partnership that's tremendously helpful is guaranteeing. So almost through the sovereign, protecting against risk. In a country like Pakistan, you have to ask yourself, can the government protect against risk? Often what happens then, you have facilities from institutions like the World Bank. There's something called MIGA, which is almost an insurance guarantee scheme against political risk. But if you are leveraging the international community to guarantee that risk, it reduces the national interest from the discussion. So one of the challenges of doing public-private partnerships in a place like Pakistan is an over-reliance on the international community, which can reduce the national interest. And so there needs to be that balance. When it comes to private provision, you have to see if they're incentivized enough to avoid what I spoke about earlier, which is the abdication of comprehensive public services. So if you have a private role in healthcare and education, are they going to make sure that there's coverage across different socioeconomic segments? And is that built into the public-private partnership? So ultimately, what's truly important in Pakistan, or if we were in Kenya, or if we were in other countries like Jordan, is leadership. And underneath that leadership, clear institutionalized structures that are effective and efficient and can support PPEPs. And that's something, I would love to hear more about if we see that in Pakistan. A, do we have the leadership? And B, do we have the institutional depth? And we can look at the ministers and the special assistants and all of this. I would argue with the new government, they haven't attained that confidence yet to bring to the private sector that they can really look at PPPs. I think they need to be challenged on that front. And they should be able to because they have great people like Asad Omar and others, but you have to meet that challenge. Finally, and just to kind of end on this, and of course we can talk more in the Q&A, I think we have a true and remarkable global opportunity. 75 years ago, at the end of World War II, we recreated the global architecture, politically, geopolitically, and economically. It was the time when the Bretton Woods institutions were founded, when we talk about the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and others. Here was a new global economic architecture for the world. 75 years later, we are at the advent of a new global architecture at a time of tremendous convulsion with the COVID pandemic. But we're in disarray. Who are the people globally coming together to define how we're going to have the institutions to meet the challenges of the next 75 years? And assuredly, one of the largest pieces of this global architecture is going to be a new global grand bargain around the partnership between the public and the private sector. And I would love to see not just leadership within Pakistan, and not just from the government, but I would like to see leadership from Pakistan on this conversation. What other country than Pakistan? What other leaders than those from Pakistan? What other business leaders than those from Pakistan? Some of the best and brightest in the world, some of the most successful companies. We need to have those voices at the table. I think there's a tremendous role to be played. And I think that will benefit Pakistan in the medium to long term.
Thank you, Taufiq. Thank you very much. Good insights. It is interesting to hear about new global architecture, and it is so true. I mean, given that we are going through unprecedented times in the last 4 months, where a virus which is not seen by the eye, by the naked eye, has more or less brought the whole world to a standstill and showed the power of something unseen, like never before. And that is giving way to a new global architecture, which by definition means new players can emerge and new leadership can emerge and new thoughts can emerge. And countries like Pakistan have a very strong role to play in not just defining this global architecture, but showing the way with leadership and best practices which we can adopt in this country and then take it forward to around the world. So good thought. I also want to pick, and as we go into the question answer session, I would want to talk about two things. Definitely, and I'll come to Q&A on that. One is, what is the right structure to create a sustainable public-private structure in a country, and not just have a fly-by-night kind of a thinking or a very project-based approach towards the whole concept. The other thing you spoke about is the leadership. How do we develop leadership, or how do we bring leadership together, which provides for this kind of working environment which is diverse, which brings diversity, which brings two different cultures together, and still produce the magic that it is supposed to produce. On this note, because leadership is all about people and it is very local to us, I think the best time to bring Fatima into the conversation to give her intro about the topic, share her experience. She's been also deeply involved on the technology side, devising solutions for the future and working with both public and private sector. And also, as I said, bring in the human element into it. So Fatima, over to you.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much for this opportunity as well. It's definitely a very exciting subject, and if we have the right focus from a strategic standpoint and the vision, it can change the way that the country will proceed and transform itself over the next 20 to 30 years. But I must say that the ideas that and the points that Fenton and Taufiq have shared are incredible, and that is a very strong basis to talk about the public-private partnership model and the framework that as it exists today, and what we're seeing in terms of the disruption that is taking place, not only from a technology perspective, and both my esteemed panelists have alluded to it, that the COVID crisis has impacted fundamentally the way we are thinking at government level, at the corporate level, at the education within schools, and also at a personal level. How we're doing business and how we're operating is fundamentally changing. And therefore, one of the elements that I would like to bring in very strongly is the need of the customer. Obviously, when you talk about different projects, whether it's the health or the education sector or in the construction, where you are servicing the citizen or servicing an individual, the demands are also changing. And the models have to be very cognizant of the fact that what does the end consumer, the customer, really require right now? And that's one of the fundamental aspects which links up to how the human resource development roadmap should be defined. But I just want to take a step back and talk about, if we simplify the model of public and private partnerships, and we look at the main essence behind it, it really is, yes, partnerships that my colleagues have mentioned, but also a collaboration which means you're working towards a win-win situation. So you have certain mandates on both sides, depending on which model. There are various models, as we all know from a technical standpoint, that organizations and nations, governments adopt. But if you fundamentally look at typically what the private sector party would be responsible for, you look at designing and then completing a certain project, implementing a project, and also financing a certain project. If you were to brainstorm the skill that is required in each of these elements, whether it's project management or technology or technical expertise and knowledge, which would be far perhaps greater than what the government could be providing, not only in terms of a lack of funds that they may be, or maybe they won't perhaps have access to subject matter experts or industry matter experts in order to deliver on a project at a quality standard, which is over a long-term period. Studies show that typically public-private partnerships scale over a long-term period. 20 to 25 years is an average time. And if we're looking at that, that's a fairly long-term commitment that we're looking at, not only in terms of finances, but also ensuring that the objective with which that project was put together does meet the necessary caveats. And obviously, things change in 25 years. Look at where we were in 2019. I don't think anyone envisioned or foresaw what happened to us, or is continuing to happen to us in 2020. And it is transforming the way we are behaving, how we're operating our organizations, etc. So it is extremely important for us to also realize that from a the government sector commitment, there are different governments, successive governments, which also come into play. So this is, as the Veqar Sahab, you were mentioning, what is the downside of public-private partnerships? Because it's a long-term commitment, we have to be very mindful of the fact and realistic that there will be successive governments who will have to give the commitment to these particular projects, which may have been implemented and, mobilized at a particular point in time, and 20 years later or 15 years later, there is another government in place, and what is their mandate and what are their objectives. So there are different aspects which are at play when we look at public-private partnerships. However, given the risks on both sides, it's a definite opportunity for us to develop human resources, especially for a country like Pakistan. With 210 million people, we have 60% of our population under the age of 30. That's a phenomenal number that is coming into the workforce or has just entered the workforce recently. To give them that opportunity to develop skills which are required not only in the short term, but also in the long term, and also direct certain projects, especially in the education sector, towards building that skill and building abilities and capabilities which are required for us to deliver on these long-term projects would transform the entire country in a very progressive manner. So that is extremely important. The second aspect that we talked about is leadership. Taufiq has also mentioned that, but leadership development is key. We've had these discussions on different forums as well, where in some cases there were certain observations, is there a leadership crisis? And within the corporate companies, you talk about succession planning. Are we doing something similar in the public sector? What are the gaps that are there? So if we have public-private partnerships that work and are focused on a certain goal, where collaboration is strong, where partnerships work together to resolve differences and transfer that knowledge, then you're also looking at enabling leadership development in both sectors. So that's a definite advantage that we would have. And then we talk about the real focus of the digital transformation that is taking place, which is enabling organizations to seamlessly work across borders as well. and seamlessly work across sectors as well. At least that should be the grand plan in terms of integrating how different sectors come together, they work in order to deliver on a particular project with the skill set that they have, and enabling individuals and mobilizing resources wherever they may be in order to deliver value. So these are very important factors that we must keep in mind when we talk about public and private partnerships: collaboration, leadership development, and a large population which can be utilized for long-term projects, typically in health, finance, construction, and even infrastructure and power projects as well. I am aware of Gavi as well. I believe they're doing some incredible work already in the government of Sindh, especially for child immunization. And they're collecting some data. I came across that recently as well. There are other projects as well on the power sector, in the power sector. And these are success stories. No project is without issues. No project is without any dissonance that may occur. But if we, at the time of contracting, at the time of agreeing upon the mandate for both parties, and there is certain ways of mitigating the risk and certain ways of ensuring a resolution, I feel that there would be a tremendous impact on how this can create value for the human resource of Pakistan, as well as enable it to go to the next level.
Thank you very much, Fatima. So we had Fenton, who spoke about 5 key ingredients which needs to be kept into consideration when going forward with the public-private partnership. Then Taufiq came in and he spoke about SDG 17, where he also very passionately spoke about 17 being all about partnership and having details about the importance of developing partnership to take the model forward. And then you came in and you brought in a very different insight, where you talked about keeping in mind the customer, which is people, right? And how do you make sure that at the end of the day, they get the service the way they want it, at the speed they want it, with the quality they want it, and the public-private partnership should be able to deliver that value to the customer, which is the citizen of the country, in the most efficient, most cost-effective manner. So that was, I think, brilliant to kind of sum it up. You also brought in the leadership angle into it, and that more or less is the first question I want to bring to the table to all the participants, and see if you can, each one of you can share your perspective. In order to make this public-private partnership successful, do we need a different class of leadership than what is typically available, which is in many cases single dimension, either a public sector leader or a private sector leader? Do we need a different skill set for leadership to make public-private partnership successful? And what could be those ingredients to ensure that we pick the right people and we have the right leadership to drive it towards success? Fenton, if I may come to you, how do you see the leadership, or what sort of things that leadership needs to be aware to make this public-private partnership successful? Is it something unique, or any leader with good credentials is good enough and will make it a success? Fenton, over to you.
I think at the level of political leadership, the vast majority of politicians who I've met both in Pakistan and elsewhere tend to be quite drawn to the idea of public-private partnerships, particularly the more experienced politicians who have tried to reform government structures. They've struggled, and they're looking for other ways to do it. So I think at the political level, often you see a lot of enthusiasm, and perhaps sometimes too much enthusiasm for public-private partnerships models. I think the real challenge is the administrative leadership that is going to do the implementation. And as we talked about earlier, there are lots of details to get right. Those details vary from country to country. So what works in one country isn't necessarily going to work in another. So to some extent, you only learn by doing it in your own country, sometimes even your own province, and so on. And so having the administrative leadership in place, officials who have worked through those details, who have experience of public-private partnerships, who know how to get these small things right, is critical, not just for getting the details right, but also for the confidence of the private sector. If they see a set of bureaucrats or officials who don't have experience and don't know what they're doing, they're going to run really fast in the opposite direction. And so I think the real challenge is, how do you build that administrative leadership within government? And actually, one thing one advantage Pakistan has at the moment is it does have a lot of officials who have a lot of that experience, but they're scattered all over the government. They are transferred around, they move from province to province. And so I think one big question for the government might be, how do they bring together the experience that is already in the government into potentially things like PPP units within ministries or departments of finance that can support other ministries and provide them with the administrative leadership and expertise that they need to get this right. But it's a great question, and so much of the success or failure of these things comes down to, do you have good people in the right places? And a lot of paper and ink has been wasted writing about the pros and cons of the idea, when the problem isn't necessarily the idea, it's the implementation, and do you have the right leadership in place? So fantastic question, though.
Thank you, Fenton. And you talked about political leadership and also administrative leadership. On that, just a historical note for everyone. I think the first person who started talking about public-private partnership in Pakistan was a political leader, first women prime minister of the Islamic world, late Prime Minister Benazir Bhutto. And she passionately advocated this concept from political leadership viewpoint to talk about public-private partnership. And since then, we talked about projects, we talked about subsequent government and political leadership taking that concept forward. I'll come to the question on structure later, but I want to stay on the leadership question for now. So while on the political front, there is buy-in and there is a lot of traction towards public-private partnership, but it's the administrative arm, which Fenton very passionately describes, all about execution, stupid, which is the executing arm. Does it provide you the needed leadership? And do they have the right skill set, the backing, the enablement, the empowerment to make projects successful? And what is needed to bring that administrative arm into a manner that it delivers value to the customer that Fatima spoke about? Taufiq, your comments, especially on the administrative side of the leadership.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great point that Fenton made. And often, especially in a country as diverse and large as Pakistan, with so many different administrative units, we can often forget about the different levels of leadership, right? And the different dimensions of it and the different functions of it and leadership across those functions. So definitely agree with Fenton. In Pakistan, there's a public-private partnership authority that was established in 2017. It actually exists, I think, under the Ministry of Planning. You can go to the website to understand how professional and modernized it is. I think there's no shortage of creating there's no shortage, I think, across South Asia, to be honest, whether India, Pakistan, or Bangladesh, maybe a legacy of the British, of administrative units and functions and people and bureaucrats. And some of these bureaucrats are fantastic, but I think when we talk about leadership, you also need culture, and I talk about organizational culture. When some of the places that really required public-private partnerships are countries with great ambitions but limited resource, either financial or human. And so two big examples of leaders I would point to are Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid, the ruler of Dubai, and really the leader of Singapore who built it up, Lee Kuan Yew. I think they're really tremendous examples, both in terms of leadership around public-private partnerships, the culture, and then establishing the complementarity and the administrative aspects to then drive that forward. And so I do think we need that political leadership, whether it's going to be at a provincial level or federal level in Pakistan, who, I was at a speech by the Prime Minister in Saudi Arabia, and he said, we are open for business, okay? And, I think when you hear Prime Minister Imran Khan speak, you can get excited, right? And then I'm going to say, okay, let me go follow up. What's actually going on? And I was looking at, particularly myself, thinking about how can we expand our foot? Maybe we can bring some things to Pakistan. And the complexity of the actual practice of operationalizing the business or private sector engagement with the rhetoric, and so was quite large. So what is important is leadership that provides a credibility when people trust that leadership and then verify in practice. Then establishing a culture of, when we are saying public-private partnerships, we really mean it. And then complementing that with, take this authority, make it functional, give it the resources so it can work throughout Pakistan and support with the right framework and dynamic. And then as it comes to people that you institute or have at different levels of the state who are facilitating this, or maybe it's a new authority maybe there needs to be a public-private partnership of a body that actually facilitates public-private partnership. Because if it comes from one side or the other, maybe it doesn't really work. But, in the role that we play, I think Fenton plays, and probably Fatima and many of you, you need people who can understand both sectors. And so if you have leaders who just understand one sector, that's going to also be a challenge. You have to blend this. So this question, I think the dimensionality of leadership is I think the seminal question, and to think about it conceptually, practically, as you're implementing at different levels. This is where if there is a corporate Pakistan group takes on an initiative to really bring this out, what is it going to take? I think this is it, because we really need this type of thinking, that very, very involved at different levels and practical, to make this happen.
Thank you, Taufiq. Fatima, I want to come to you with the same question, and I just want to expand beyond the leadership aspect, while I do want you to touch upon the leadership as well. But Taufiq also talked about the culture piece, right? And what is the right culture that is needed to make the execution happen that Fenton spoke about. And while it is about leadership, and it is about credible leadership, where you see less gaps between what is said and what is the situation on ground. But the problem is, when the situation on ground is driven by a culture which is not conducive, or which is not in complete harmony with the vision, how do you create that culture which brings two cultures together and produce the public-private partnership for the customer that we are talking about? So if you can touch upon the leadership aspect and also the culture aspect of public-private partnership for sustainability, that would be great.
Fenton and Taufiq have made very pertinent observations on leadership. My take on it is adaptive leadership. At this point in time, the crisis that faces all of us and continues to face, whether you are the leader of a government or whether you are leader of a private sector entity, at this point in time, we are in a way at war footing in terms of how are we dealing with the crisis. And this particular situation that we have has pushed, I feel, pushed back all norms that existed in terms of how does leadership emerge through crisis. One of the main things I feel is adaptive leadership, whether it is political, whether it's administrative, whether it's corporate. And those who will be able to have the vision and the commitment and the will to put certain directives, set down certain directives, and address certain risks and issues as they arise, be proactive about it.
I think
but
she
also
is disconnected.
Hello? Hello?
Fatima, we can hear you.
Yes.
You can hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Did I get disconnected in between, or should I just continue?
No, you were okay. No, you were okay.
All right.
I could hear you well.
So essentially, that is the first rule, I believe, at this point in time, in terms of how we see the situational leadership gambit emerging, where we talk about adaptiveness and agility. The second is around culture. Definitely, each nation, each organization has its own unique culture. To recognize not only not only recognize but define that culture, but also recognize there is immense diversity that exists if we're looking at national leadership or government leadership. The diversity of ethnicity, the diversity of religion, of different backgrounds, of gender, etc. The list goes on. And then to work towards a certain shared objective in terms of, if we're talking about nation building, what are those objectives and how does it impact positively and create value for the citizen? That is one aspect. The other aspect is governance. Taufiq also mentioned institutionalizing a framework which is sustainable to ensure that if a plan is put into place, you may have the direction, you may have the leadership, but you need the commitment and the will to see it through. And that can only be done by strong institutions which are sustainable enough. And that requires good governance. That requires certain monitoring mechanisms which will enable projects and initiatives to stay on track. We all know that the flip side of public-private partnerships are possible project delays. Well, there are always, usually, data shows that there are always project delays, maybe due to political hurdles or funding issues, etc., or certain government changes. There are different reasons why certain projects stall. But the governance, a strong governance mechanism, and having collaboration at the entities that will have to make it possible at the right time is absolutely essential. That means you have to have the right person in the right seat. Fenton also talked about good people at the right seat. It goes back to the leader's vision. It goes back to the direction that leader has given, whether it is at the political level, administrative, or corporate. But right now, the need that we have, the immediate need that we have, is how adaptive is our leadership, how open are they to different points of view, how open are they to accepting that they may be incorrect or ill-advised in certain aspects, and there are technical experts that are out there who we can leverage on to really add greater value and also ensure that the people who are engaged in that particular mission or that objective also derive that value at the end of the day. So it is a very comprehensive, integrated framework that has to be in play in terms of governance, adaptive leadership, the cultural diversity, and engagement of the right people.
Very, very well summarized about leadership, having the right framework around culture, adaptive leadership, governance structure to drive the right value. As you know, we have another 10 to 15 minutes before we close. So I want to move towards a bit of the future, and see if we can get some ideas from the esteemed panelists on what needs to be done for sustainable, successful public-private partnership model. So Fenton, if I may start with you. In your view, what are the three things, specifically in the context of Pakistan, but since we have global audience, but also in the context of developing economies, what are the three top things that countries need to do to ensure that they reap the benefit for public-private partnership in the way it is enshrined in the concept of PPP, where, as everyone more or less said, that not in every case we have been able to get the benefit of the concept the way it is initially thought out to be. So what, in your view, are the three top things that needs to be done for developing economies or countries like Pakistan to ensure sustainability of the model, to ensure that there is a supply side of leadership which develops the right culture for delivering the outcome to the customer, as Fatima mentioned? Fenton, top three from your side.
Excellent. It's a very good and difficult question. But perhaps my top three, the first one would be thinking very carefully about whether a public-private partnership is the right answer to each problem. And I think in many cases the answer will be yes, but also in many cases the answer will be no. I was having a conversation last week with a minister about this, where overall the message was to say, look, actually there are lots of opportunities to improve the government system quickly. And if we're thinking about how to make the biggest difference for citizens the fastest, it's much better to do those things that can be done quickly to improve the government service. And if instead we go down to a public-private partnership route, we're going to spend the next 3 years focused on the public-private partnership that's going to suck up all of the leadership and administrative time, and the other things that we can do right now to make services better for citizens tomorrow, next week, are not going to happen because of the focus on the public-private partnership. So I think being careful about when this is the right answer and when it's not the right answer is important. I think the second thing, and Fatima I think has already said this, but I really want to pick up on it, is putting the citizen and the interests of the citizen first, and working backwards from what is the citizen's current experience, what do they want the experience to be, what is the gap, and then how do we solve for that. I saw one public-private partnership for schools, which had been designed by a set of economists who were passionate about public-private partnership, and they wrote a 50-page document about this educational public-private partnership. And in all of those 50 pages, they didn't once mention students, teachers, learning, teaching. There was no consideration of what is the experience of the end user. It was a fairly good, but nonetheless a very theoretical exercise in, from an economic point of view, what should this look like? And so I think and this is true not just for public-private partnerships, but for anyone working in government, the absolute number one rule is always to put the citizen first and to understand what is the frontline experience, not just in Lahore and Islamabad, but in the most remote, difficult parts of the country. One chief minister I worked with used to call them the far-flung areas. And he always said, is this going to help people in the far-flung areas? And so putting the citizens first, I think, is crucial. And then you talked about sustainability, and I think sustainability is a question that we get asked about a lot, both in the context of public-private partnerships, but also in the context of a lot of other things. And we could probably talk about that for a whole session. But the single most important thing about sustainability is you have to deliver results first. And if you can set something up be it a public-private partnership or anything else, that is delivering results that citizens like, that providers like, that has traction, that is recognized as a success story in the international community. It is very hard for another government or another program to come along and then stop it. And I've seen examples of this in Pakistan where particularly the change of government a couple of years ago, where ministers came in, they saw existing initiatives that were working. They, for whatever reason, didn't necessarily understand them or want them, and they tried to stop them. And the outcry from the public, from the government, was so strong. People saying, this works, we like it, we value it, why are you stopping it? That in every single case, those things continued, and in many cases, the ministers embraced them and continued to support them and continued to expand them and so on. So I think that lots of people worry about sustainability. I think the key is to worry about delivering really good services for citizens and to trust that if you do that and you elect good political leaders, the sustainability will take care of itself. But great question, and I'll hand the floor back.
Thank you, Fenton. So if I summarize before I go to Taufiq, you talked about that there is no such thing as one size fit all, which means each project has to be evaluated on merit, see which one delivers the best model for the customer at the end of the day in the most efficient, transparent, and cost-effective manner, and select the best model, but don't think public-private partnership or only public or only private is the answer in all cases. So no one size fit all, always putting customer first, which means always putting the citizen first in whatever you are designing. And third is in terms of structure, defined outcome that you want to achieve, and then measure those outcomes at the end of the project or as you go along with the project. Great 3 points. Thank you very much. Taufiq, I come to you. Your top 3 for sustainability and making or showcasing the success of public-private partnership. Over to you, Taufiq.
Okay, so my 3 are success, no corruption, and impact. So it sounds, like a truism to say success. Of course, success breeds sustainability. But if you need to have success, right, to show the value, right, and it needs to be seen as something that's achieving, and that's very important. And I think that's also rewarding politically. And Fenton mentioned about that interplay with people and politicians. Very, very important, right? And so that will be reinforcing. So success is key. And success in a place like Pakistan, unfortunately, needs to be tangible within a certain amount of time, right? Because if it's too long of a time, other issues come up, people lose interest, and then they see the amount of resources or energy being spent, and they lose faith in what it is. So number 1 is success. And, if you look at leadership and the leaders who have a North Star and always pointing to that North Star and what are we achieving and coming back to it in the cabinet meeting and when they're speaking to the public, they're holding themselves and their officials to a criteria of success. And we shouldn't shortchange ourselves anywhere in the world. And definitely, I think, in Pakistan, there should be no shortchanging of expectations. So that's number 1. Number 2 is it cannot just be success in and of its own right for the project, but impact. We can sometimes be in our elite confabs. All of us are linked to different institutions and associations. And we have to think about what is the impact on everybody in the society in the different socioeconomic segments. And we can even be feted and receive awards and be in the newspapers, and yet it's not really having an impact. And in places where you have, and America is one of these places, more than Pakistan, I would say, but corruption of the political class and the serving of the political class to a narrow band of interest rather than the broader interests of the population, you can go a number of years before you realize that you are not really having an impact on the people that matter. And when that comes back, it emanates in ways that are much more destructive. in the society. That's broader, and we can talk about how that's impacted Pakistan from the 1970s, 80s into the 90s and different issues. But it can also come in the place of real tremendous loss of trust in the private sector. It can lead to nationalization and different things. So impact, and really understanding impact beyond what we like in our, to be honest, our webinars and stuff. We really have to make sure we're thinking about impact. And then the third is corruption. There cannot be corruption. I think the everyday person, if they look at a public-private partnership, will say, this is a way for my public funds to go to somebody who's already wealthy. Okay, somebody who already has money. Yes, there's a distrust in government, and there's some people. There's going to be that thought that the private sector can build a road that the government can build. But I think there's no trust. I think Karachi Electric is an example where that's going to be the case. And so you really have to have zero tolerance for corruption. Absolutely. And so success, impact, no corruption.
Thank you, Taufiq. And success is the key, because that showcases the whole model in ways like never before. And I'm extremely happy you talked about impact, and not just impact in the context of the elites, but in the context of the poor and common citizens of the country, so that they feel the impact. And you also brought about the concept of doing it in a timely manner, which is extremely important. So success is not just about completing the project whenever, but completing the project in time, so it creates the right impact. And of course, you brought in integrity piece as a third element, which we keep saying, integrity is ticket to the game. You don't have it, you can't play. It's as simple as that. So great three pieces from you. Over to Fatima before we do the summary round. I can see a few questions popping up, and I'll ask some of them very quickly to the panelists, because we are running out of time. So Fatima, over to you for your top three.
So very quickly, but before I say my top three, as a citizen of this country, my main inspiration has always been Quaid-e-Azam. And I feel that if we were just to honor his, some of the wisdom and advice that he gave us from a discipline perspective, from a unity perspective, from a celebrating diversity and working together and really building a nation, I think we can go far. So that's a personal, as a citizen of this country, I would like to see, inshallah. And maybe it's already changing. But from specifically your question on public-private partnerships, I would start with good governance that enables collaboration between all players or agencies that are involved. So that is the government, the private sector, the other entities like technical expert consulting firms, technology firms, etc., legal professional services, where they have to work together towards a common goal. And if the governance is strong, then that would enable a collaborative model which will ensure that there is value being added. I would also like to see more adaptive leadership. Again, adaptive leadership that does not only build a strong human capital base with a long-term focus on building next generations to add value to this country, but also celebrating diversity and the human factor, to be compassionate, to be tolerant. It is so important, especially in this day and age. And unfortunately, with whatever's going on, we're losing sight of it as humans as well. So it's sort of a reminder to all of us that we have to be mindful that unless we are compassionate about the journeys that we're making, we won't be able to be successful in a more collective basis. And lastly, meritocracy that adds value. So really bringing in the right person in the right seat, irrespective of which sector it is, and then not only incentivizing them, but rewarding and recognizing their contribution to the nation.
Good points, Fatma. So you kept talking about adaptive leadership, and right at the end, you also brought about collaborative leadership when
Yeah.
you brought about the concept of governance, and it is extremely important, especially these public-private partnerships are extremely complex in nature. They involve multiple agencies, so the leadership not just need to be adaptive, but needs to have the ability to deliver outcome, collaborating with multiple agencies and multiple stakeholders. And of course, meritocracy is so important, having the right person for the right job, which is so good. Top three from all the three participants. Before I go towards conclusion, I saw a couple of questions, and I'll quickly ask each of the panelists different question. I saw two, so at least I know two of them. So one of the question is it a good idea to outsource some of the public services to more efficient governments like government of Dubai or government of Singapore? And since they've done it, why don't they come in and be able to do the same things for us? Instead of doing public-private partnership, we do government-government partnership. Will it produce the magic? Fenton, your views on this?
There are some great examples of that working quite well. For instance, there are a couple of Middle Eastern governments that have outsourced parts of their legal system, for instance, the UK, and used UK courts for some of their cases. And so there are some examples of it working well. I've actually seen quite a number of governments outsource might not be quite the right word to describe this, outsource bits of their education system to Singapore. So relying on Singapore to help train teachers and school leaders. And Singapore has an incredible education system. But if you look at something like teacher training, Singapore is very good at teaching Singaporeans, training Singaporeans to teach Singaporean children in Singaporean schools in Singapore. And when you take that whole system and try and use it to train Pakistani teachers to teach Pakistani children in Pakistani schools in Pakistan, the context, there are just so many differences between those two systems, those two countries, those two schools, that it hasn't tended to work very well. And so I think the lesson from those countries that have tried to do that is that they can learn a lot from places like Singapore, that they might want to borrow elements of, say, a Singaporean system for their own countries. But if you're going to have successful health and education systems in Pakistan, the solution is going to have to come from within Pakistan, maybe leveraging lessons and support and learnings from other places, but it's going to have to be designed there by Pakistan itself. It's a really good question there.
Yeah, good. And again, goes back to your point that no one size fit all. So you need to evaluate and see what's the best model for the problem you're trying to address. Taufiq, there was another question that I saw about examples of successful public-private partnership. You spoke about THAR, which is a great example. Fenton spoke about Punjab Education Foundation. But anyone else which comes to your mind, and quickly some of the highlights of it and why you think they were successful?
Yeah, I think the energy and infrastructure are the ones to point to, because you were able to have significant investment that was successfully realized and created an impact that we can see. And at least, I think in those projects, the integrity was there. I think that the example of tuberculosis, there's been a lot of public-private partnership around there, and the story of TB and reduction in Pakistan is one to look at. Both at local and federal levels. And I will just add, just on the point that Fenton raised, Pakistan in the 60s and 70s and even 80s was lending its expertise globally, to South Korea, to the UAE. There's a lot of chits to call in for Pakistan to now leverage the expertise of others. And if you remember in 1985, when Emirates Airlines was founded in the UAE, which is now really the world's leading airline, it was funded with $10 million and 3 planes leased from Pakistan International Airlines. So there's nothing wrong with borrowing and leveraging expertise from abroad, but it should be in the service of building institutions at home and not in people who just come to take funds and leave.
Thank you, Taufiq. Fatima, last question to you. Do we need a structure around public-private partnership to carry this as a concept forward rather than looking at it just on a project-to-project basis? Taufiq talked about, I didn't know that there is actually a public-private partnership board that exists, at least on the website, if not on paper. But do you think there is a need for such an empowered body to make the concept sustainable?
I believe that an overarching framework is important in terms of providing certain guidelines that would define how different projects work. However, that said, it also, what Fenton was saying, it just made me think that on the education side, for example, there were certain sensitivities that did not work, let's say, in Pakistan. So you rethink the model because of that particular service that is being provided. But if you look at infrastructure projects or transport projects or which or maybe even on the health side, there are more successful projects that have, because maybe the cultural sensitivities are very different. So yes, a broad framework is important because it would highlight certain guidelines in terms of the various types of models that are there. We must keep in mind that there are different models that exist for public-private partnership frameworks that are available as well. And the nature of those projects are also different. So that awareness and that knowledge has also to be shared on a wider level, and maybe success stories also shared with a wider audience. But one thing is extremely important, Veqar Saab, if I just may add this, is that when we have any kind of agreement, it is also about agreeing to set the parameters for each party and having transparent mechanisms in place and let each party do the job rather than interfering with what needs to be done. So that becomes also part of the governance model in terms of ensuring transparency, in terms of ensuring that each stakeholder is there in order to add a certain value, and they must deliver with minimum interference as well. So I believe at a global, at a national level, it would definitely add value.
Thank you. Very strong point. So as we've run out of time, actually, we have gone over time from the allocated time. My apologies, Asfar. But once again, great topic. Before I conclude, just as a format, I just want quick last 1 minute comment from each of the panelists on what you think about the dialogue, but also about public-private partnership and its future in the context of Pakistan. Just concluding 1 minute comments. Taufiq, we start with you this time. I can change the order, so I have the right to go googly when I want to.
Well, I hope this is the start, not the end of the discussion on this topic. It needs to be kind of continued and thought through in a deep way to realize some of the topic, the objectives we talked about. Let me just conclude by saying the solutions for any of the countries that we work in ultimately come from within the country. The leadership around any of the initiatives ultimately come from within the country that were there. We can look at global examples, we can look at inspiration, we can look at backing, but Pakistan has all the resources, all the talent, all the institutions to make this a success. And I think people should hold the leadership accountable at provincial and federal levels to pave the way, but then be ready not just to complain, but be a partner with the government when it starts showing the way. And I think that means having constructive rather than destructive conversations around public-private partnerships. Cynicism ultimately can be the ultimate obstacle to any solution being brought forward. So those are my concluding thoughts.
Yeah, thank you. Cynicism is the ultimate obstacle to progress on anything. Fenton, your concluding comments. Thank you very much, Taufiq.
A few thoughts. One is lots of people have written about the acceleration of changes that we've been seeing over the past 100 years and how things are moving faster and faster. And this year, even while in some ways we've slowed down, we've seen many existing trends, be it e-commerce, for instance, or people working from home, that have accelerated dramatically. And I think we're going to see a continued acceleration of things over the coming months, and public-private partnerships, I think, will be one of those. And second, I think as difficult as this year has been, in every crisis and in every period of discontinuity, which is what we're in at the moment, there are opportunities. I think, for instance, the disruption to education services and health services this year creates huge opportunities for governments to say, and the private sector to say, when things go back, let's not go back to doing what we were doing before. Let's go back to doing something that is fundamentally better for citizens and others. And so I hope that people around the world take advantage of what opportunities there are in this situation. And I think public-private partnerships will be a part of that.
Thank you, Fenton. Fatima, your concluding comments.
Well, I would like to quote Quaid-e-Azam again and say, just like he said that no country can rise without the men and women working together. Similarly, the country cannot rise if the public and private sectors don't work together in order to commit themselves to nation building. And we also have a very large expat diaspora that is out there who are very capable and competent. So I believe that it is essential for us to leverage on this human capital that we have, which is stellar, and also leverage on the expertise of other countries as well. Because it is, again, I'm repeating myself, it is about collaboration, whether at the national level or the international level. And therein lies the true success.
Thank you, Fatima. I want to thank all the panelists for a very profound discussion, great discussion on a topic which, as I said initially, is not generally talked about. People talk about examples of public-private partnerships. Something which has done magic to this country is as recent as our till-date handling of COVID. It has positively surprised not just people in Pakistan, that many are attributing to it to miracle for the first time in this country, but it has positively surprised almost everyone around the world. But the real magic happened because it brought about what Fatima has been emphasizing, collaborative management from the federal, from the provincial government, from the agencies which are working together, various people taking care of the customers. And I'm a personal witness to that. The number of calls I got when my sons got COVID from various agencies, and not just the calls that I got, the empathy that people showed when they called, I genuinely felt cared by the government. And this was unreal. So this kind of collaborative management does produce magic. So this COVID outcome, you can attribute it to whatever you like, but it is the magic of adaptive and collaborative management that we have seen at display in this country, and the result is in front of us. And if we can take public-private partnership in the same spirit, because we are bringing the brilliance of two different sectors together to produce the magic for the ultimate customer, then the result will be no different, possibly even better than what we have been able to produce till date for COVID. I keep saying till date because COVID is not over yet. And I need to continue to emphasize that point. So let me just conclude, and I'll try and conclude, do my concluding comments, bringing together all the top 3 points that have been brilliantly made by the 3 panelists. So first is, please remember, there is no such thing as one size fit all. Evaluate projects on merit and then decide which is the right model and go for it. Always keep consumer or the customer in mind, and always keep in mind the impact it will make to the common man in terms of what they expect, in terms of how best they get the service at an affordable level that they can actually be able to use it. Bring meritocracy ensure success of the project in time using adaptive and collaborative leadership and the strength of adaptive and collaborative leadership. I hope I was able to pick up all the points from the three panelists in their top three. Once again, I want to thank Nutshell Forum and Corporate Pakistan Group for organizing this webinar on an absolutely brilliant topic, not something which is normally you hear in such webinars. Great insights from all the three panelists, great learning for someone like me on a topic which is not something that I've gone deeper into, but surely provides me enough interest to learn about it a lot more. Once again, thank you so very much. Thank you, audience, for listening to us. Hope you found the insights helpful. Hope you found them, insightful for you to propagate the concept of public-private partnership in this country and make it a success. Once again, thank you so very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Veqar. And on behalf of Corporate Pakistan Group, I am grateful to Taufiq, Fenton, and Fatima as well. This is a very important topic, and because of the expertise of Taufiq and Fenton, we specially designed this. I'm grateful to Globesight, our partner for this summit, the conversation, and especially the Maha Qasim. And we will continue more dialogues and more conversations on public-private partnership, not only through web, but in our physical conferences in the near future. So with this note, I want to announce the next 26th webinar of Corporate Pakistan Group on Friday, September 4, 5 p.m. Pakistan time and 4 p.m. Dubai time on fixing Pakistan's power sector. There are three more very important panelists, and we will announce the details in a day or two. So Pakistan Zindabad, and the meeting is adjourned.